Here we are on the beginning screen of our home sewing machine automation system. This screen is going to allow us to set our quilting area. This may be the whole space within your frame, or it may just be a small portion that you're planning on working with for your particular quilt top. We're going to set our quilting area together. As you can see, we are in layout, and that's highlighted here on the left-hand side of our display. Our display is giving us instructions on how to do this, so we will just follow along with what it's telling us to do. Our instructions say to move our machine to the back left corner of our quilting area and then press the plus button. Our plus button is located at the bottom right-hand corner of our display. Next to the plus button, you have an X button. If you happen to set the wrong point, you can always hit the X button, reset your machine into place where you'd like it to start, and hit the plus button again. I'm going to move my machine to the back left corner so we can start. I'm pushing my machine as far back and as far left as I can go. I'm now going to back it off from both of those positions just a little bit. I don't want my carriage to hit the side of my frame, so I'm going to pull it over just a hair from the left-hand side so that my carriage doesn't accidentally hit the side of my frame. I'm also going to pull it forward a little bit. I'm going to show you why. As we look at how my particular machine sits on its carriage in relationship to the frame, I've got a little bit of mechanical pieces coming off of my needle bar. As my needle's stitching up and down, I don't want any of those mechanical pieces to hit either my plastic clamps that I've got here holding my fabric in place or the metal clips that are holding the fabric over top of my clamps. So I want to make sure that I have space behind my needle and my needle bar so that nothing hits these plastic pieces. You may have a different frame than I have, so you may have to adjust, or your machine may have its moving parts in different places than I do. So make adjustments accordingly. If your machine happens to hit any of these parts, it can make a lot of noise, or it could throw off your whole automation system and give you an error. So always give yourself enough room so that nothing like that can happen. With where I am now, I'm going to hit my plus sign. When I do that, you will notice that the X and the Y axis on the bottom of your display will set to 0, 0. This will give your robotic system a starting point for the space that it can quilt in. If it doesn't reset to 0, 0, or as you're moving your carriage across to set your next point, if the numbers don't change into the positive, you may need to adjust your belts. Our new message says move our machine to the front right corner of our quilting area and press the plus button. So I'm going to slide my machine down my frame and towards the front of my quilting space and quilting frame. I am as far right as I can go and as far forward as I can go. Like I did on the left side, I'm going to back off from the right side just a little bit so that my carriage and my cords that are attached to my machine are not hitting the right side of my frame. And I'm also going to back off a little bit from the front and move it back some. I want to make sure that I have some space back here between the back edge of my quilting machine and my fabric here that's attached to my frame. I don't want anything getting caught here or pushing too hard here that might cause problems. So I've given myself a little space, and now I'm going to press that plus sign on the front of my display again. I'm going to bring this back into view for all of you. So you can see that now that I've done that and pressed that plus sign again, my robotic system has calculated the table width and the table height of my particular quilting space. This is going to vary for you depending on how big your quilting frame is and how wide of a throat space you have available on your machine. I'm going to hit the check mark here in the center of my display. And when I do that, you will see that I've got a dotted orange outline, and that is the quilting space in which my robotic system will quilt. Since we have our quilt area set, it's time to add a pattern. Our patterns are located in our pattern feature as we move up the left-hand side of our display. Our pattern feature is right above our layout feature. It looks like a little file folder. When we touch on that, it highlights, and now we have all of our patterns that are preloaded on our robotic system. Our patterns are arranged numerically and then alphabetically. That might make it easier to find something you're looking for. You can scroll through the patterns on your display one of two ways. Because this is a touch screen, you can scroll with your finger just like you would scroll on your personal phone or tablet at home. You can look through the different designs just by using your finger on your touch screen. If you know you're looking for something in a specific place and you know you need to scroll either to the top or the bottom very quickly of the designs, you can use the little slider square that's off to the right-hand side and scroll quickly from the top to the bottom. This makes it a little faster if you know the general area of what you're looking for. So maybe I'm digging around in my patterns knowing that I need a pumpkin. I can scroll down to where the P's would be in my alphabetical list, and I can find my pumpkin design a little bit faster. We can scroll through very quickly, and I'm just going to go back up and find a pattern that I want to use. This one looks good. It's called Circle City. Because I want to use it, I'm going to touch it with my finger, and it's going to highlight orange. When it highlights orange, we know that's the pattern we're choosing to use. And to load it into our quilting space, we're going to hit the check mark off to the right-hand side. When we do that, you can see that it loads our pattern into our quilting area designated by that orange dotted line that we set earlier. Now we can work with it. Once we've added a pattern into our quilt area, it's time to work with our editing feature. Our editing feature is available to us here on the left-hand side of our display. It looks like a little square with a pencil in it. Once we've loaded a pattern into our quilt area, we're automatically switched into Edit. You can see our editing features here on the right-hand side of our display. That's what we have to work with to make our design look the way we want. As you can see, my particular design is hanging out the bottom of my quilt area on my display, and I've got some blank space over here. So we've got a little bit of work to do. The first thing I'm going to do is work with my repeat function. I can add horizontal repeats of my design so that I can fill in my space a little bit better. Let's work with that now. My repeat function is the first icon at the very top of my inside green ribbon. It looks like a little rectangle with arrows coming out the side and the bottom and a plus sign. If I touch on the icon, it's going to turn orange with a white background, and you can see here that my horizontal repeat has a minus and a plus, and there's a number 1 in the middle because right now we're looking at one repeat of it. I can change those repeats by using my plus and minus sign. If I touch my plus sign once, I've now got 2 repeats of my design, and it's changed to a 2 in the center. If I touch it again, I now have 3 repeats. If I choose to remove one, I can hit my minus sign and it'll take one away. I'm going to go ahead and add one more into place, and we're going to work with it like this with our next feature, scale. So you can add and subtract repeats as much as you'd like to see how it works out with your quilt area. Don't be shy with this. Changing your repeats can change the look of your design and make your designs appear a little bit more dense or a little bit more open on your quilt top. With the repeats of our pattern finished, it's now time to work with our scaling feature. We need to do this because we have an awful lot of our pattern outside of our quilt area to the right and a whole lot down on the bottom outside of our quilt area. We want to scale our design so that it gets smaller and fits into our quilt area space. Our scale feature is in Edit, and Edit is still highlighted here on the left-hand side of our display. Our scale feature is down here on the bottom right-hand side of our display. It's this little square that has arrows coming out of the corners. We can touch on that. It highlights orange, and it's got arrows coming out of the corners. We have some options to work with our scaling. We've got a plus and a minus to use for vertical scaling, and a plus and a minus to use for horizontal scaling. We also have a little lock down here. Right now it's locked, and I can touch that and unlock it. This is your proportion lock. If you have your proportion lock turned on and it's highlighted orange, you can change your design proportionally. That means that you can keep the original intentions of the design and it will change proportionally, both horizontally and vertically at the same time. This is kind of useful if you've got a design that you want it to keep its original intentional look, and that's helpful with things like animals or hearts or even circles like what I've got here. You want them to keep their original shape. Sometimes shapes can get a little wonky looking when they get changed vertically and not horizontally, or horizontally and not vertically. So that proportion lock can be useful sometimes. But I'm going to take it off in this instant, and we're going to work with it without that. Now I can change this design and make it smaller vertically by using my minus button here. Every time I tap on the minus button, it gets a little bit smaller vertically, and you can see this little black box and this slider bar move closer to the minus. I can do the same thing here horizontally, and you can see my design shrinking horizontally, and that little black box and the slider bar moving closer to the minus. But there's another way to work with your scaling feature. Remember, we have a full color touchscreen display, so you can scale with your touchscreen. Simply touch on your design, and when you do that, you get a lot of different colored nodes or little circles appearing around your design. Your scaling nodes are the ones that are blue. They appear on the corners of your designs and then in the middle of the sides of your designs. You can use these to move your design in and out so that it changes the size. If I touch on this bottom node here and squish it with my finger a little bit, I can squish my design up until it meets the bottom line of my pattern box. And if I grab the node here over on the other side, I can push it in so it meets inside the right-hand side of my pattern box. Now that looks awful teeny tiny, so I might want to see if I can get a bigger view. The easiest way to get a bigger view really quickly is to go back and hit your layout button. And then you can see a little bit better if you've gotten close. I have some space over here on the right-hand side, so let's go back to Edit and use our scale feature again and try to get things a little bit closer. I am just going to go out one more time horizontally with my plus sign, and look, it filled in that space all the way. I think this looks pretty good, so I think we used our scale feature to the best of our abilities. Again, you can scale horizontally and vertically with your pluses and minuses. You can use that lock button there if you want to scale proportionally. And then just by touching on the design, you can use the blue nodes all the way around your design and use your touch screen to do it quick and easy if you're more comfortable that way. Another great editing feature we have is a move feature. Sometimes you might have to move your design around your quilt area to get it to fit exactly where you want. Let's look at our chain of daisies here. We may want to center this a little bit better. We've got some space over here on the right and a little space on the bottom. Let's use our move feature to be able to do that. As you can see, we're still in edit here on the left-hand side of our display, and our move feature is on the right-hand side of our display. It's underneath our repeat feature. Our move feature is a square, and it looks like it's got a little crisscross with arrows on top of it. When we highlight that, it turns orange with a white background, and we've got some arrows, both vertically and horizontally, to be able to move our design around. We can use those to move our pattern up and down and right and left. Let's go ahead and look at that now. If I use the down arrow, I can move my design bit by bit in my space downward. I can also use the up arrow to move it upward. So that looks like it's about centered in my space there, going vertically. We need to work on it a little bit horizontally. So I'm going to use my right and left arrows down here at the bottom of my display. I can touch my right movement arrow to get it a little bit closer and touch that as many times as I need to, trying to get my design centered a little bit. I may have gone a bit too far, so maybe I need to use my left arrow just to get it centered some. So you can use your move button to get a design centered or moved into a location that will suit your quilt top best. But once again, we do have that touchscreen option. So if we touch on our pattern, instead of using the blue nodes that we did with scale, if you look closely in the center of our design, we actually have a green node. If you touch your finger on the green node in the center of your design, you can slide your finger around your display, and that's going to move your entire design. You can drop your design down anywhere you like simply by removing your finger from the display. It's very easy to use the touchscreen to move your design where you'd like it. So your move feature is simple to use with easy arrows to move your design up, down, left, and right. And then you have your green node on the center if you touch on it so that you can use your touchscreen movements. Whichever way works best for you is the best way to use this feature. Let's take a look at our rotate feature. Our rotate feature is located in Edit. That's highlighted here on the left-hand side of our display. And on the right-hand side of our display, rotate is over here. It looks like a little square on point with some swishy arrows. If you highlight that, it's going to turn orange with a white background. And at the bottom of our display, we now have a plus sign, a minus sign, and a degree reading. The degree reading will change as you use your plus and minus and rotate your pattern. If you use your plus sign, your pattern is going to rotate to the right or clockwise. If you use your minus sign, your pattern is going to rotate to the left or counterclockwise. Let's go ahead and take a look. As you can see, when we press our plus sign, our pattern is rotating to the right or clockwise 1 degree at a time. If we use our minus sign, we'll go in the opposite direction, and it will rotate 1 degree at a time to the left or counterclockwise. And that number changes there in the center. But maybe, depending on how we have our pattern loaded, or maybe how we have our quilt loaded, we might have to do large changes to our rotation. The quickest and easiest way to do that, instead of pressing the plus or minus, is to use your touch screen. We can highlight our pattern, and our nodes up here for us, and the node for using your rotate is your little red node on the corner. If you touch on your red node, you can then swing your pattern around clockwise and counterclockwise to get it in the orientation that you'd like it to be. So if you wanted to do a full 180 flip, depending on how you had your quilt loaded on your frame, you sure could do that. And then you can fine tune it into place if you needed to, just to get it exactly level and the way you want it to be. This is a great way to be able to fit patterns into your quilt top just the way you like them, even if they have a direct orientation for a top to bottom. You can always change them and do your editing the way you need to make it work for you. As you're working with your editing features, you may notice off to the right-hand side of your display, you have an undo and a redo arrow that will highlight for you. As you make changes, you may decide that you liked how something looked before, or maybe you want to go forward and you liked how something looked after you made changes. You can use your undo and redo buttons just like you do on your computer at home. If we make a change to our design here and maybe shrink it down a little bit smaller vertically and horizontally, and then we may change our mind and we wanted to go back to the original size, we can use our undo button and make it a little bit bigger vertically and a little bit bigger horizontally again. But then maybe we've changed our mind again and we want to go back a few steps. We can undo what we've just done and redo what we've just done. So your changes are never permanent. You can always undo and redo the changes you've made so you can go back and forth and look at your differences between what you've edited and whether you want to keep it one way or another. It's always great to have these correction tools as you're looking at your designs until you get it just the way you like it. Always use your undo and redo so that you can figure out how you like your pattern best. In the top right-hand corner of our edit screen, we actually have a little minus button here. This minus button is going to allow us to delete all of the pattern work that is inside our quilt area. Maybe we've chosen a design and have changed our mind, or maybe we finished stitching out something and we no longer want to use this and want to put something else in this pattern box. You can very easily hit the minus button right here. And when you do that, it's going to delete the whole pattern that's in here. If you want to choose a new pattern, you can go over to your pattern file here on the left-hand side of the display, choose a new pattern, and do your editing work from there. If you've changed your mind and you want your pattern back, simply hit your undo button and it will appear for you again. At this point, we've worked with all of our editing features and it's time to stitch out our design. To stitch out your design, you'll need to go to your home feature. Your home feature is located here at the top left-hand corner of your display. It looks like a house, and when you touch on it, it turns purple. You also get a few new icons on the right-hand side of your display when you're in your home feature. You get a green circle for start, a red circle for stop, and you get a little needle with a piece of thread running through it. This little needle with the thread running through it is actually an indicator of whether you're going to be tracing your design out or whether you're going to be stitching your design. As you see the icon here, the needle and thread are white. When the needle and thread are white, if you were to start stitching out, it would simply trace your design instead of actually stitch on your fabric. Now, sometimes we may want to trace out our design to make sure we truly have our design placed where we want, and we will know exactly where it is as the machine traces over that area. But if you want to stitch out your design, you have to engage this needle button by touching on it. The needle and thread will turn orange and the background will turn white. When this is highlighted, then you know you will stitch out your design. From here, we're ready to go, so we can hit our green start button. When we do that, our robotic system will start giving us directions in the stitch out process. The first direction is going to tell us that the machine will move to the start of the pattern block and the pattern will start. Verify that the needle is in the up position. Now the first direction is telling us that it's going to the start of the pattern block. Every pattern has a start and stop. The start is indicated by the little tiny green circle at the beginning of a pattern, and the stop is indicated by the little red square at the end of our pattern design. So our machine is actually going to move when we engage our system to where our start is. So no matter where your machine is sitting on the frame, the robotic system is going to take over movement of the carriage and move your machine to this starting point. So be aware of that. And what's really important about this movement is verifying that your needle is in the up position. You never want your needle in the fabric because as the robotic system takes control of your carriage and the movement, if your needle's in your fabric, you're going to end up tearing your quilt top. So just make sure that your needle is in the up position and you're ready to start. If you need to do a little bit more work or you're not ready to stitch out, you can always hit the X button and you can go back from here. Now that it's time to stitch out a design, we're in our home screen with our home screen highlighted here on the top left-hand corner. Our house is purple. On the right-hand side of our display, we're going to engage our needle. Right now we're in trace mode. We want to highlight our needle so that it turns orange with a white background so we know we'll be stitching. And then we're going to press our green button so that we can start. Our robotic system is going to give us our instructions on how to proceed. The first instruction says the machine will move to the start of the pattern block and the pattern will start. Verify that the needle is in the up position. I can see that my needle is in the up position. We never want to start with our needle in our fabric. The robotic system is going to take control of the movement of your carriage, and you don't want to have your needle in your fabric because you risk tearing your quilt top. We're going to go ahead and hit our check mark, and the robotic system is going to think for a moment and then take control of that movement and move the machine over to its starting position for the design. Now that we're there, we're going to start getting some more instructions. The first instruction on the screen says do a single stitch with your quilting machine. For my particular machine, I have a needle up-down button on the side of my machine. Yours may be located in a different place, but you're going to do a single stitch. I'm going to press my needle up-down button so that it goes in and out of the fabric. I'm going to hit the check mark on my display to move to my next instruction. It says pull up the bobbin thread and then press OK. I can move my machine slightly out of the way so that I can pull up both my bobbin thread and pull my needle thread through my foot. I have both of those threads out of the way so I can hit the check mark on my display again. My robotic system has just moved my machine back into its original start place, and my new instruction says cycle the needle to lock your stitches. I cycle my needle 3 times because that's how many locking stitches I prefer. You may prefer to lock your stitches more or less. It's all a matter of preference. And those of you who like to bury your threads in your quilt instead of do locking stitches, you may want to skip this. I'm going to cycle my needle 3 times. And I'm also going to make sure that my presser foot is down. You don't want to start stitching with the presser foot of your machine up because it is going to make a giant mess. Let's hit my check mark here on the screen and wait for the next instruction. The next instruction is telling me to turn on the stitching on my long arm, and my machine will start moving after I press OK. So this is a 2-step process here. The first instruction is telling me to turn my stitching on, and that's located here on my stitch regulator. So you have to get your machine running, and that's the start button on your stitch regulator. Yours may look different than mine, but I've got a start button here. The other instruction says that your machine will start moving after you press OK, and that's the check mark on your display. So I'm going to hit my start here, and then my check mark here, and my design will start to stitch out. So my start here on my stitch regulator is going to get the needle moving on my machine, and then I hit the check mark there, and now my pattern is starting to stitch out. What do you do if you need to momentarily pause the stitching with your machine? Maybe you need to answer a phone call and you don't want to hear the machine running in the background. Or maybe you need to let the dog out and you don't want your machine stitching while you're outside. Simply hit the large pause button at the bottom of the display and you'll get a message to turn the stitching off on your long arm. And then you can hit the check mark on your screen. Your whole design is momentarily paused where you're at so you can take care of whatever you need to. When you're ready to come back to the stitching, simply press the large start button down at the bottom of your display. You'll get the same instructions as when you started your pattern. It says turn the stitching on your long arm, and then your machine will start after pressing OK. So we turn the stitching on our stitch regulator, and then we hit the check mark on our screen, and our stitching picks right back up where we left off. Another great use for that pause button at the bottom of your display is if you have a thread break or run out of bobbin thread. Let's see what happens. I'm going to hit the pause button. It's going to tell me to turn the stitch regulation off, so I'll hit my check mark saying I did that. And then we have the option for thread break. I'm going to hit that now, pretending like I broke my top thread. I'll hit thread break and it says move to where the thread broke and press OK. So we'll have to remember to do that after we fix our thread problem. I'm going to raise my needle, and then I'm going to raise my presser foot and just move my machine out of the way for a moment so I can clip my threads so we can truly pretend like my thread broke. Sometimes your thread breaks and you don't know why. So this is really handy to fix that. Sometimes your bobbin thread runs out and you do know why. It's because you didn't check it before you went on to your next row. And this happens to me quite a bit. I tend to think there's more thread on my bobbin than there really is, and I tend to run out in the middle of a row. This is the best way to fix it. So let's assume that I've rethreaded my machine, I've double checked my bobbin, and now we're set to restart. The first thing that you need to do was to remember what those directions were at the bottom of your display. It said to move to where you'd like to restart. So I'm going to move back to where my thread broke, or where I clipped my threads off, and I'm going to line my machine needle back up about 3 stitches back. I want my threads to overlap as they're stitching so that the threads don't unravel where they broke off, and they will double stitch over top of each other just a little bit. You do what you're most comfortable with. This is where I'd like to restart, so I'm going to hit the check mark. My robotic system is just going to move a hair to center itself perfectly because you can't always get it lined up exactly, and it's going to ask if this is where you want to restart. I'm going to hit the check mark because this is where I'd like to restart. Now I get instructions on my display to do a single stitch with my machine. So I'm going to just grab my bobbin thread here, lower my presser foot, and do a single stitch with my sewing machine. I'll hit the check mark on my display, and it says to pull up my bobbin thread. I can push my machine out of the way a little bit, grab my top thread to tug up my bobbin thread. Once I have both of my tails, I can hit the check mark on my display, and my robotic system is going to move back into place where my starting point is. I now have my message to cycle my needle so that it ties off. I've cycled my needle 3 times because that's what I like to do, but you do what you're most comfortable with. I'll hit the check mark on my display. And now we'll turn the stitching on our stitch regulator, and we'll hit the check mark on our screen, and our design will pick up exactly where it left off when we broke our thread. We'll hit the start and the check mark, and off we go. It's that easy to fix a thread break problem, so whether your top thread broke or you ran out of bobbin thread, this is the best way to fix that problem. You may have noticed on your stitch out screen that you have a little number over here on the right-hand side with an arrow above it and an arrow below it. This is the speed at which your robotic system is running. It is a percentage of the full speed. Right now, I am running at 60% of full speed. That's what's appropriate for my particular sewing machine and what I'm working on. This speed may change on a lot of different factors. Everybody has a different sewing machine that runs differently, so your speed may change based on the particular machine you're using. The speed may also change based on the thread you're using, the pattern you chose, the density of pattern that you're stitching out, or even the fabric that you're using or the amount of batting that you're using. So just know that you can change this speed to accommodate whatever you're working on to get the best stitch quality possible and be most comfortable with how your machine is running on the robotic system. If you use the up arrow, you can increase your speed, and if you use the down arrow, you can decrease your speed. You'll need to play with these speed features to find what you're most comfortable with your machine, and it may change on every project. Make sure that you adjust and feel like you're getting the best quality for each project you're working on. As we're stitching out our design, we need to be aware of that red stop button in the upper right-hand corner of our display. If we hit this button, it is going to stop our stitching completely, and it will stop everything instead of just pause everything. So we will have to start back at the beginning of our stitching. If I do that now and hit the red stop button, it's going to tell us to turn the stitching off on our long arm and hit the check mark on our display. And what happened is our screen has now reverted back to the point where we are ready to start stitching from the beginning of our design over here, not all the way over here where we currently are. So make sure if you hit that stop button, you're perfectly sure that that's what you want to do. Otherwise, if you just need to temporarily stop, make sure you use your pause button. Maybe you did hit the stop button while you were stitching out, or maybe while you were stitching out, you left the room, and when you came back, you realized that your bobbin thread ran out somewhere in the middle of your row, and you finished stitching out, but all you have left on your fabric over here is just a bunch of puncture holes, but no stitching. So you'll replace your bobbin, but you need to pick back up where it left off, where you have no stitching, but your pattern finished out. How do you get back to this point where it left off without having to stitch all the way back through the design that's already completed? We have a solution for that, and it's called Set Start. So here's our row, and we left off over here. We need to line back up with this point. I'm going to hit Start again. I haven't changed my row. I haven't moved my fabric. All I'm going to do is restart my pattern just in a different location. So instead of hitting the check mark here, I'm going to hit the middle button that says Set Start. It's going to say move to the desired start point. So just like in a thread break situation, I'm going to move my machine to where my bobbin ran out, line my machine back up with those stitches. I'm going to go back about 3, that way they overlap for me and I don't have anything that might come unraveled in the wash. I'm going to line my machine up there, lower my presser foot down, and I'm going to hit my check mark. My robotic system is going to center back over that line, and then it's going to ask me if I'd like to restart from here. I'm going to say yes with my check mark. Now I'll go through my stitching instructions. My display is telling me to do a single stitch with my machine. I'll hit my check mark. It's asking me to pull my bobbin thread up, so I'll just move my machine out of the way so I can pull up on my bobbin thread tails and get both of my tails out of the way for me. I'm going to hit the check mark on my display. My machine's going to move back into place. I'll cycle my needle to lock my stitches as instructed by my robotics. I'll hit the check mark on my screen. And I am told to turn the stitching on my stitch regulator, and then I can hit the check mark on my screen and my pattern's going to pick back up where my bobbin thread ran out. So I'm going to hit my stitch regulator. My my machine stitching, so I'll hit the check mark on my display and off it goes. And I'm just going to scoot in here and clip my threads off. And it's that simple to pick up where you left off. If either you ran out of the bobbin thread and it stitched all the way out, and you came back into the room, you've noticed I left off in the middle of a design, it's stitched all the way through my pattern, how do I go back? Or if you accidentally hit that stop button when you really meant to hit your pause button instead, and you need to get back to where your pattern left off somewhere in the middle. Here we are at the end of our stitch out. We need to finish out what our robotic system is telling us to do. First, we need to turn the stitching off on our long arm by turning off our stitch regulator. Then we can hit the check mark on our display. The next thing we need to do is cycle our needle to lock our stitches. That's something that I do, so I'll cycle my needle 3 times. If you're not someone who locks your stitches and you prefer to bury your threads, you'll want to skip this step and keep your tails nice and long to bury them later. You'll hit your check mark here, and now you've finished an entire row of stitching. It's that simple. You may have noticed down at the bottom left-hand corner of your display that you have 2 little spy glasses. There's a minus in one and a plus in another. These spy glasses are actually zoom features. So if you'd like to get a closer look at your pattern, you can zoom in, you can zoom out. If you press the spy glass that has the plus sign in it, you will zoom in to your pattern. You can see a little bit more detail, and it's helpful when you're editing to see if maybe you're over your lines and you need to do a little bit better of a job of either scaling or moving your pattern into your pattern box. If you'd like to zoom it out, you can simply use your minus button and you'll zoom back out to be able to see a more full view of your pattern box. This is very helpful with all of your editing features, so you have your zoom in and zoom out available to you at any point. A helpful feature that you may have noticed while watching the videos is that you have a horizontal and vertical thin blue line that runs through your screen. Where they intersect is actually where your needle is located. This is very helpful because as you're doing things in your robotic system, you always know exactly where your needle position is. So as I move my machine around on my carriage, I know exactly where my needle is going to be. You can see the crosshairs move across the screen. Your crosshairs will change when you're doing things like stitching out your pattern. You can follow the crosshairs across the display as it traces along your pattern lines where your machine is actually stitching. When you need to zoom into certain places, you can see your crosshairs a little bit closer and see where they are in relationship to your design. And your crosshairs are also helpful because when you use your thread break function or your set start function, they will move into place when you're lining up with a design. And you know both on your screen and on your fabric exactly where your needle is. It's a very helpful tool. Another helpful tool that you have on your robotic system has actually been lying in the background this whole time. If you look at your robotic screen, there's actually a very faint grid pattern that's in the background behind all of your layout boxes in your designs. This pattern is your grid spacing, and each little block represents a certain number. This number can help you decide how big your pattern actually is. On my display right now, my grid spacing actually represents 1 inch per block. But this is something that you can easily adjust depending on the type of quilt that you're working on, the pattern work that you want to do, and how precise you want to be with your pattern size and placement. Let me show you how to adjust your grid spacing and what that looks like. Remember that the little tiny blocks that you see in my background represent 1 inch right now. To change your grid spacing, you'll go down to your settings icon, which looks like little gears, and highlight that. When it's highlighted, you now get a completely different looking screen that has tabs across the top. The tab we want to use is called Parameters. You can touch on the word Parameters and it takes you to the appropriate screen. Down here, we have the word Grid Spacing, and there's a little white box next to it. Like I said, my grid spacing represents 1 inch, which is why you see the number 1 there. But maybe you'd like to change it to represent something else. You can touch the box next to grid spacing and you'll get a keypad open up. Here's where you can change the size of your grid spacing. Maybe you want your grid spacing only to represent 1/2 inch so that you can do a little bit more precise placing and sizing of your pattern. You can type in 0.5 and hit your check mark, and now your grid spacing has changed to 1/2 inch. So when you go back into your layout field, your squares are going to be much, much smaller. I don't even know if you can really see how tiny they are on the camera screen. You can go back into settings and you can even change your grid spacing to something larger. Maybe you want each square to represent 2 inches. You can type in 2 and hit your check mark. And when you go back into layout, now your squares are much larger. So this is all a matter of what you want to work with, what you're most comfortable with, and what might be appropriate with the size quilt you're working with, the pattern you're working with, and the size you want it to be. If you kind of look at what we've got set up here with our daisies, now that our squares represent 2 inches, our daisies are just over 2 inches tall. Because I can see my grid square, most of a daisy fits into 1 square, but it just bleeds over a little bit. So that's a good idea for you to help size your design appropriately for your quilt top. Use that background grid square as a tool to help you with your measuring of your quilt pattern designs. You may have noticed on your display screen down at the left-hand side here, you have an I button and it says Info underneath it. This is your information button. Right here on the screen, you can get information about all the different features at the touch of a button. No need to look online for information or even in a paper manual. You can touch the I for Information button, and once it's highlighted black with a white background, you can touch on another icon on your display to get information about what it does. If we touch our undo arrow here, it's going to tell us that it's our undo, redo the most recent action. So that's what it does. Underneath it, we have what looks like a little film strip. That's going to allow us to download and watch a video on how this particular feature works. Let's touch the icon for our video. It says no video is selected at this time on the device. Would you like to download it? Now, I am currently connected to the Wi-Fi in my home studio, so I am able to download. If you'd like to download your videos, you need to be connected to the Wi-Fi in your home or sewing studio. Because I'm connected, I can hit yes. It will take a moment to download the file, and it says the file has been downloaded, and please try to replay. So if I hit OK from here, I can now hit my information button, open that icon back up, and when I hit the film strip this time, it's going to play a video for me on how to use the feature. I'll go to my video player. And there's my video on how it works.
Take steps back in the pattern
it's that easy.
Process.
Your home sewing automation system comes with the ability to import 20 patterns that you've purchased off of quilt pattern websites. Though we've loaded the system with 120 various patterns to suit many needs, you may want something very specific for a particular quilt you're working on. You can find quilt patterns on a multitude of quilt pattern websites. Just make sure when you're purchasing, you select the QLI file format to load onto your robotic system. This is what will work the best. Once you have your file purchased and loaded onto a USB stick, the easiest thing to do is load it one step at a time, starting with adding your USB stick to your robotic system. I have a USB stick here, and my USB ports are on the left side of my display. I'm going to insert my USB stick into my top USB port on the left-hand side of my display. Once I've done that, I will highlight the Patterns feature on the left-hand side of my display. When I do that, it brings up all of my patterns in the tab that says Patterns. But I want to use the Pattern tab that says Import, Export. When I highlight that, I can now import my file showing here at the top of my screen. If I touch Import File, I get a note that says, please select storage location. My storage location is external because it's saved on an external device, which is my USB stick. I'm going to touch external. When I do that, my robotics display is going to read everything that is on my USB stick. My quilt patterns that I've purchased are in a file that I have saved as quilt patterns. So I'm going to touch on that. It highlights blue, and I'm going to hit the word open over here on the left or on the right hand side of my display. When I do that, it's now going to open up that file and show me all of the patterns that I've purchased. Let's choose one so that we can import it. I'm going to choose this one that says Dino Swirls. When I touch on it and it highlights, it loads down here underneath file name. When I hit open, it's that quick. It says my import is finished and one item is imported. I'm going to hit my check mark. And when I come back up to the Patterns tab, I can scroll through my designs and look for it. Now remember, your designs are listed numerically and then alphabetically. So for us to find the design we just imported, it was called Dino Swirls. So we need to look down in the D's. And here we are in the D's, and right here is Dino Swirls. It looks like some dinosaur feet with swirls in between. So we've successfully downloaded our QLI pattern Dino Swirls that we purchased, and now it's ready for use. Like I said, you can import up to 20 different patterns that you purchase so that you can use things that you like outside of the 120 patterns that come preloaded on your home sewing automation system.